When you think of Scotland, you probably picture rugged highlands, fierce warriors, and a rich, independent culture. But what if I told you that before Scotland joined with England, it had its own grand, and ultimately disastrous, dream of a global empire? This is the unbelievable story of how Scotland bet everything on a colonial dream, from the frozen shores of Canada to the sweltering jungles of Panama, and lost so badly that it led to the very creation of the United Kingdom. The late 17th century was a tough time for Scotland. Its neighbour, England, was getting fabulously wealthy from its colonies, while Scotland was struggling. A brutal famine known as the 7 Ill Years had left the country reeling from hunger and instability. To make matters worse, English protectionist laws, like the Navigation Acts, basically banned Scottish ships from the colonial trade, cutting them off from the riches of the New World. Watching England's prosperity from the sidelines, and desperate for its own piece of the action, the Kingdom of Scotland decided it needed an empire. This wasn't just about cash, it was about national pride. It was a chance to prove that Scotland could be a world power all on its own. Long before the infamous Panama disaster, Scotland first set its sights on North America. Way back in 1621, King James VI of Scotland, who also happened to be James I of England, granted a charter to a courtier named Sir William Alexander. The plan was bold: to establish a new Scotland in the massive territory between New England and Newfoundland. After all, there was already a New France and a New England, so why not a New Scotland? In a little flourish of Latin, the land was christened Nova Scotia. Sir William's plan for funding this whole adventure was pretty ingenious. He created a brand new hereditary title, the Baronet of Nova Scotia. For a steep fee, any wealthy Scot could buy the title, which also came with a casual 16,000-acre estate in the new colony. The cash raised would pay for the ships, supplies, and settlers. And here's a great legal loophole. Under Scottish law, these new baronets could take possession of their land without ever leaving home. They'd just receive a clump of dirt and a stone on the grounds of Edinburgh Castle, a small patch of which was legally declared to be Nova Scotian soil. After a few failed attempts, a breakthrough finally came in 1629. Sir William's own son led a successful expedition and established a small settlement at Port Royal. They built a fort, and for a brief, shining moment, New Scotland was a real place, home to 70 Scottish settlers carving out a life in the New World. But the colony was on shaky ground from the start. France also claimed the territory, calling it Acadia, and the colony's fate wasn't going to be decided in a Canadian forest, but in the halls of European power. Ongoing wars between Britain and France sealed its doom. In 1632, as part of broader peace negotiations, King Charles I agreed to hand the territory back to France in the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The Scottish settlers were ordered home. Just like that, the first dream of a Scottish empire was over. And while the name Nova Scotia stuck, along with the flag and coat of arms, this first independent effort had failed. A small footnote in the grand chess game of European politics. While the dream of Nova Scotia faded, the ambition for a Scottish colony did not. In fact, it was about to come roaring back, bigger, bolder, and a whole lot more reckless. This time, Scotland wouldn't just try to claim a piece of the world, it would try to control the entire thing. By the 1690s, Scotland was a nation on the edge. Economically, it was falling behind, and politically, it was living in England's shadow. The country was desperate for a game-changer, and into this desperate climate stepped a man named William Paterson, a Scottish financier who had actually co-founded the Bank of England. Paterson was a man with a massive, world-changing idea. His plan: to build a Scottish colony on the Isthmus of Panama, in a region called Darien. The goal wasn't just to plant a flag, it was to create the world's commercial hub. Paterson envisioned an overland trade route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific, a shortcut that would let ships bypass the treacherous voyage around South America. This colony, New Caledonia, would be the emporium for the world. Whichever nation controlled this crossroads would control global trade. The idea was electric. In 1695, the Scottish Parliament created the Company of Scotland, trading to Africa and the Indies, and Paterson's vision became its one and only mission. The plan was to raise money in London and across Europe, but they immediately ran into trouble. The powerful English East India Company, terrified of a new rival, lobbied King William to shut the project down. Under immense political pressure, English and Dutch investors pulled out, leaving Scotland completely on its own. But this English sabotage didn't kill the dream, it turned it into a patriotic crusade. Outraged, the people of Scotland vowed to fund it themselves, and they did. In a massive, nationwide fundraising drive, people from every walk of life, nobles, merchants, farmers, widows, poured their life savings into the company. It's said that nearly everyone with a little money to spare invested. In the end, they raised a staggering £400,000, a figure estimated to be about a quarter of all the money in the entire country. Scotland had quite literally bet the farm on a single, daring venture in the jungles of Panama. In July 1698, a fleet of 5 ships sailed from Leith carrying 1,200 hopeful colonists. But they weren't sailing toward a glorious new future, they were sailing toward a catastrophe. When they arrived on the mosquito-ridden coast of Darien that November, the brutal reality of their situation hit them like a physical blow. One of their first jobs was digging graves for those who died on the voyage. The land they called Caledonia was a sweltering, unforgiving jungle. The colonists, used to the cool air of Scotland, were completely unprepared for the tropical heat and torrential rain. The heavy woolen clothes they'd brought to trade were totally useless. The jungle was nearly impossible to farm, their food supplies rotted in the humidity, and starvation set in almost immediately. Then came the diseases. Malaria and yellow fever tore through the settlement of New Edinburgh. The death toll was horrifying, with reports of 10 people dying every single day. The leadership fell apart, quarreling among themselves, while the settlers sickened and starved. To make matters worse, the Spanish, who claimed all of Central America, saw the colony as an invasion and began launching attacks. But the deadliest blow came from their own king. William of England, not wanting to anger Spain, issued a proclamation forbidding any English colonies in the Americas from trading with or helping the Scots. Cut off from all support, they were utterly and completely alone. After just 8 agonizing months, the dream was dead. Of the 1,200 colonists who set out, over 400 were in their graves, including Patterson's own wife and child. In July 1699, the handful of emaciated, fever-ridden survivors abandoned the settlement and fled. And the tragedy only gets worse, the news didn't travel fast enough. Before anyone in Scotland knew of the failure, a second fleet with over 1,000 more colonists had already set sail. They arrived to find a ghost town of rotting huts and fresh graves. Besieged by the Spanish and weakened by disease, they surrendered in March 1700. Of the roughly 2,500 people who sailed for Darien, only a few hundred made it back to Scotland alive. In total, it's estimated that around 2,000 lives were lost. The return of the few, broken survivors brought the horrifying scale of the disaster crashing down on Scotland. The nation was plunged into collective grief and fury. Riots broke out, with the public blaming both their own leaders for the failure and the English for their betrayal. The human cost was devastating, but the financial blow was just as crippling. The £400,000 all that invested capital was gone. Powerful families, wealthy merchants, and ordinary people were ruined. The Scottish economy, already fragile, was pushed to the point of total collapse. The Darien disaster hadn't just destroyed a colony. It had bankrupted an entire nation. Scotland was left shattered and isolated. The grand dream of building an empire had died in a Panamanian swamp, and the failure exposed just how vulnerable the kingdom was on its own. Scotland was broke, its confidence was broken, and its leaders were faced with an uncomfortable question: if we can't make it alone, what do we do? The answer would come from their powerful southern neighbor, and it would change history forever. In the wake of Darien, the idea of a political union with England, an idea that had been resisted for a century, suddenly started to look less like a surrender and more like a lifeline. England had been pushing for a union to secure its northern border, but Scottish leaders had always refused, fearing they'd be swallowed by their larger neighbor. The financial ruin of the Darien scheme changed the entire calculation. For the Scottish elite who had lost everything in Panama, union offered a path to economic recovery. England had a booming economy and, crucially, a massive colonial trading network that Scotland would gain access to. The English also offered a very controversial incentive. As part of the treaty, England offered to pay a sum of money called the equivalent. Officially, this was to offset Scotland's share of England's national debt. But the amount just under £400,000 was almost exactly what had been lost in the Darien Scheme. In fact, a huge chunk of that money went directly to compensating the shareholders of the failed company. For the ruined investors in the Scottish Parliament, it was, essentially, a bailout. This financial carrot is often seen as the key reason the deal passed, famously captured in Robert Burns' line about being bought and sold for English gold. So, in 1707, despite widespread popular opposition across the country, the Scottish Parliament voted to dissolve itself. On May 1, 1707, the Kingdom of Scotland ceased to exist, and the new Kingdom of Great Britain was born. The spectacular failure of Scotland's imperial ambitions was a direct cause of the loss of its independence. The nation had gambled everything on building its own empire and lost. The price of that failure was the very sovereignty it had been trying to protect. From the shores of Nova Scotia to the jungles of Panama, Scotland's quest for an empire was a story of incredible ambition and even more incredible failure. The final, devastating blow in Darien is seen by many historians as the tipping point that pushed a proud and independent nation into a political union with its oldest rival. The dream of a Scottish global empire died, but in its place, a new reality was born. So, while Scotland's own empire never happened, its people and its ambition would become a crucial part of building another, much larger one, the British Empire. A bitter irony, or a story of pragmatic survival? The answer, like the history itself, is woven into the very fabric of the United Kingdom today.